Marvel Snap players are known for a lot of things, but one thing they love above all else is complaining. Let's take a look at these hot takes, including, is it too early to hate a new card? Iron Patriot decks are the new Arishem, and personally, it has made ladder extremely unfun again. I feel like it's impossible to predict things now. Even when I've played IP, I get trash, and my opponent gets the perfect Shang. Unpredictability just makes this game infuriating. So, I never really liked this as an argument against Arishem in the first place, but I do think that this sort of really highlights the difference between perception and reality, because the part of this that I really wanted to dive in on was, every time I play Iron Patriot, I get something bad. Every time my opponent plays Iron Patriot, they get something good. And this highlights like sort of the difference between what we're talking about here and the difference between our perceptions and reality. Because when your opponent gets something bad from Iron Patriot, or for example, Arishem, they just don't play it or lose. So you only ever see your opponent play the cards when they're good. You don't see all the times when your opponent gets a sentry that they can't play off of Iron Patriot or whatever. You don't see all the times where they get an Arnim Zola that they can't play because they don't play it. But you do see all the times when you get something unplayable because you see it, it's in your hand, it's right there. And so I think that is one of the things that is one of the hardest like hurdles to jump over if you're a card game designer, is that like cards that are specific, you're only going to get blown out by them. And then when you play them, you're going to see all the times when they're not that good. Like if you put a tech card in your deck, like a Shang-Chi or something, and then you play a bunch of decks where Shang-Chi doesn't do anything, you're going to look at Shang-Chi and be like, this card never does anything. But then when you're playing a deck where you provide your opponent the chance to get value out of their Shang-Chi, it's going to do a lot. And I think this dynamic where it's like you only see your opponent's cards when they're the best thing they can do. Your opponents are only ever making a good decision most of the time. Like they're not going to play a card that doesn't do anything. And so it sits in their hand when it doesn't do anything, but you have the full range of experience. You see what you get from Iron Patriot every time, and you only see what your opponents get when it's good. Doubling down on Iron Patriot takes, Iron Patriot is extremely unfun to play against. When completely random card generation cards are good, it removes a lot of skill out of the game. I see this take a lot, and it typically showed up in relation to Arishem, so I think this is the part where I want to talk about the broader take of like, Arishem gets rid of skill, Iron Patriot gets rid of skill. I don't think when completely randomly generated cards are good, it removes skill from the game. I think that it removes a certain type of skill from the game. It rewards improvisation as opposed to encyclopedic knowledge. And it can also reward encyclopedic knowledge, but it puts you in a space where the game is less fully figured out. And I think on the whole, it is probably a good thing to do that. I think most of the time, I would rather play a game where there is hidden information versus where I know for a fact what my opponent's plan is and how they plan on executing it. It definitely does make me less likely to win. And I think that that is true. But I'm not necessarily sure that making me less likely to win makes it take the skill out of the game. It just makes it a less one-to-one direct correlation between I know exactly what my opponent is doing and all of that. And I also think that this sounds weird, but like the card game definition of skill is a little bit different than it's used in other like competitive contexts, right? Like in other competitive contexts, it's not just the knowledge, but it's how you can use your body to implement that. Like you don't just need to know how to dribble a basketball, you need to have the coordination to implement that. You don't just need to know how to dunk, you need to actually be able to do it. And I think in card games, people talk about skill, but a lot of card game skill is, I won't call it rote memorization, but it sure helps. And I think that adding some elements that make it something other than that, something other than just knowing the how of what to do, I think that's actually a good thing. Obviously, you can't get a card game to be the level of that a basketball game would have or something like that. You can't do it, right? But I do think that there is something to the idea that card game skill is not necessarily something that would be desired as the be-all end-all. I think that a game that was purely card game skill based would actually kind of get a little bit boring. And I think adding that extra variance in is the closest a card game can come to adding that bit of like, hey, you may know how to do this, you may have all the skills, but you also need to do something else in addition to that. And I think that's where the magic of like competition comes from. It's not just, I memorized everything, I know the 12 cards you're playing, that's skill. I don't think that is skill. I think that there needs to be some level of improvisation in it in order for it to be skill and not a learned thing. And I think that this kind of gameplay promotes that improvisation. And I honestly think that's good. Bob is getting nerfed to 1/4 and will still be meta. Bob might get nerfed to 1/4 and might still be meta. Yeah, when I look at what this card does and what this card is, I find it hard to believe that a 1/4 version of it would still not be good. I think when it first came out, a lot of people, myself included, once it got buffed to 1/5, it was like, oh, okay, this is a 1/5 vanilla. It's just very good when I care about that. It's not very good in like sort of bounce hella metas, but in everything other than that, it's a really good card, right? And so this is a card that is uniquely positioned even if it gets nerfed to 1/4, because I think we look at it as, oh, that's a vanilla 1/5, right? It's actually a 1/5 with upside. I think at this point we can concretely say that Hydra Bob's text is upside. This is a thing that is good for you. If it were on a card that had a similar stat line anywhere else, I think we'd be able to reasonably recognize it as upside. But like Hydra Bob being able to be the card you play on the raft and snap out of it, or being able to get into locations that you normally can't get into, that's upside. This is an upside ability. And so I think if they nerf it to 1/4, it will be a 1/4 with upside. And thus, I will probably still play it. Gambit should be an activate rather than an on reveal. I think Gambit actually would be a bad candidate for activate. I think a lot of what keeps Gambit relatively balanced and also gives him a dream is the fact that he is an on reveal. I don't think the Wong Gambit stuff is strong enough to deserve a nerf, but I also think it's very good that this card has a dream associated with it, and that is Wong, right? Like, that is the kind of thing where you can be like, whoa, I get to blow up 4 of their cards if I assemble my 3-card combo to do it. It's not very good, but like, that's a dream. When someone starts playing a game like that, you want them to see those combinations of cards and be like, whoa, that's really awesome. I think current Gambit, his role tends to be, he is in a discard deck, he is in a Goon Knight deck. If you made him an activate, I think that would be a pretty massive buff. And while I'm not conceptually against the idea of buffing cards, especially Series 3 cards, I am a little bit conceptually against the idea of buffing Gambit specifically. I think there is some worry about that, in my humble opinion, because I think the card would be very, very, very good. If you made it go from an activate to an on reveal, suddenly what's happening is destroy it, or discard is, at the end of every game, getting something blown up and 4 extra power on their apocalypse. You just gave them that for free. That's what the card says right now. And that's like the floor. That's to say nothing of like the situations you can put yourself in terms of like timing the activate so that you're actually able to hit specific things. I'm not against the idea of a discard activator, but that's what Bullseye is in a little bit, and it's got a much heavier restriction on it than Gambit does, which can discard anything. I think that 3/3 activate Gambit, same effect, is like very strong, and I would not want to give that buff to the deck. I would not want to give discard that ability, where it's basically just get a free extra Apocalypse proc, blow up something of your opponents at the end of the game. That seems a little too good to me. So, as much as I think people are apprehensive about Wong Gambit stuff, I just don't think that's a thing that's worth balancing around. I think it being an on reveal is good because I want them to be able to have that dream. And I also think it being an on reveal forces it to be played at times that are awkward, which is good because if it didn't have to be played at times that were awkward, it would be really strong. People love saying the meta is healthy or diverse, but in reality, I'm still only facing the same 3 to 4 decks back to back. I think I'm more annoyed at the comments than the players at this point. I think it really just depends on what you mean by healthy or diverse. I think a lot of card gamers come from games where it can be common that there is just maybe 3 actually good decks ever, and that kind of set of affairs can last for 3 months, right? So if you're playing Magic the Gathering and you're playing Standard and the best deck is the best deck and it's just going to be like, there's that deck, there's deck number 2, and there's like a fringy deck number 3, and then everything else is basically unplayable if you actually want to win. That can happen, and it happens a lot. So Marvel Snap metagames at baseline, just because of the timing of patches and how often they change, are always going to be more diverse than something like that. I also think that because Marvel Snap is so fundamentally a bit of a casual game, tournaments aren't a huge part of it. This is a relatively unsolved metagame compared to where there are big money tournaments with big money incentives. I think that helps the diversity of Marvel Snap. I think that I see a lot of weird stuff, but what you're actually responding to in terms of like seeing the same decks over and over, I think a lot of that is just the week to week, a new card came out, let's play this stuff kind of thing. And so while that can be true, I think there is a pretty wide range of diversity in terms of decks that I'd be willing to play to climb in High Infinite. I think there are more now than in some metagames we've been in. And so I do think that the metagame is relatively diverse in terms of literally the decks you can play. But where I don't think it's diverse is stylistically. Because a lot of the decks you can play are doing mid-rangey crap, right? You've got Doom 2099 decks, you've got Anti-Venom decks, you've got Wiccan decks, you've got Iron Patriot decks. They're all sort of mid-range sludge. And I think that when you look at that, I think it's very easy to say, oh, that's not diverse at all. The only thing that's really standing out as far as decks that aren't like that are things like Move Bounce or Mr. Negative. And there's always a push and pull in metagames between these mid-rangey piles and all the other stuff. Because, like, you could name other decks, right? Like, there's Arshem decks, there's, Thanos decks. People play other stuff. But I do think right now it's like mid-range built around 4 drops, Iron Patriot, ? Move Bounce. Like, that's kind of the thing that's happening. With some notable additions of like the Havoc deck kind of rising up and becoming a bigger part of the metagame as well. I do think this comment is roughly wrong, but I do think there is something to be said for diversity versus like functional diversity, which is to say, if you want to play a different style of deck, that might not be available to you. And I think one of the things that I really liked about Destroy is that it was so stylistically different from many other decks in Marvel Snap that it sort of managed to stand on its own as an additional style of deck to play that I really think the metagame misses. I am a huge Destroy truther, and I think that Destroy should always be good, and I want it to get help. Most Marvel Snap players, this includes even high-ranked players, content creators, and me, are terrible at predicting how good new cards are going to be. The consensus around how insane Kang was going to be and how bad Cannonball was going to be are perfect examples. Yeah, I mean, I think as a content creator, it's important to, like, hold myself accountable to some degree. I think cards I missed on, I definitely missed on Kang, I definitely missed on Cannonball. I tended to miss most on cards that just say win one lane. Like, the big whiffs on my end are, like, things like Red Hulk, right? Like, just things where it's just, like, I didn't really get how good that is. And I have tried to correct for that, right? Like, I've tried to correct for that kind of stuff in my thinking, but I actually think my track record recently has been pretty good. If I try to keep myself accountable, I think I've been more or less on point with most of my new card reviews for the last few months. Honestly, I think I've done really well, which is not to say I'll continue to do really well, because fundamentally what this card is saying is people are bad at predicting the future. And it's like, yeah, because it's the future. It hasn't happened yet. We're not Magic. Nobody can see the future. You can't do that. Like, this is, when I do new card content, a lot of it is because it's what my audience wants, and I often feel the need to couch it in, here's what I think and all of that stuff, because otherwise I feel like I'm not being completely honest if I'm saying, like, I played the game for 7 hours, right? I'm going to play for 40 more, and then I'll have a different opinion because that's what'll happen. But I can't play 40 hours in the first day because that's not how many hours are in a day. And so there's this weird push, I think, for people to have opinions immediately. And I would love a world if we lived in a world where it was more socially acceptable to be like, I'm not sure yet. I feel like I cost myself as a creator by saying that I'm not sure yet a lot of the time. I'll give you my first take, but it's only ever going to be my first take. And I think knocking people for being wrong about that kind of stuff is a little bit much. And this is coming from someone, again, I think I've been right a lot recently. And I just don't really think it's fair to knock people for being wrong on first takes. If they're wrong a week later, okay, then you can start knocking them, right? But if you're wrong day one, like, I don't really know. I also think that there's this weird thing where it pushes people towards either saying the card is amazing or the card is bad. And if you don't have a polarized opinion, like my Rocket and Groot stuff was like, I think this card is pretty good, but it's only really going to be worth picking up if it ends up being truly amazing. Like, that was sort of my take about this. Like, this is a really good card, but there's a lot more competition for a really good 3 than there used to be. And so you have to think about how that card fits in the relative overall scheme of things, or whether or not you'd go for like an archetype defining card instead. And I think even that level of nuance is kind of hard to provide, unfortunately. Like, it does, I think, probably come with a cost. It's much easier to just be like, this card is insane, or this card is terrible, it's not worth buying. Very rarely are we able to figure that stuff out on day one. I think Iron Patriot is really good. I don't think it's like busted necessarily. I think it's really good. I think I was right about Bruce Banner day one, but that was like the easiest thing to be right about in the world, right? And day one reads are just going to be people giving you their opinion. And so I think as long as they appropriately say, this is my opinion, it's day one, subject to change, I don't think it's really fair to knock people on that. Because again, you're asking them to predict the future. And so much of a card being good is about context. If Professor X didn't exist and Cannonball came out, all those people who said Cannonball sucked would probably be right. And so it's a little bit difficult for me to want to knock people down for that. The game is much more fun when everyone isn't trying out a new card each week. Bruce Banner week was weirdly refreshing. I think that's true. Like, I tend to... I don't have a fully developed thesis of this yet, but I tend to think that there's a weird thing that goes on with metagames in Marvel Snap where a card will come out and it will be good, and then it'll get subsumed into something else in the next flavor of the week. And then like a month later, we'll have an idea of where that card actually fits long term if it's still seeing play. And I think like you see that with something like Anti-Venom, where it's like the card came out, everyone played it or something that beat it, and then it sort of went away for a little bit, and then it came back in as people were like, okay, this actually is a good thing. Which is a really awkward dynamic. And I think the cards that suffer the most from this, in terms of getting overlooked, are the cards that come out the last week of a season. Because not only is it coming out like the last week of a season, it's kind of like the tail end. The game is, as far as I'm able to tell, as someone who like looks at his numbers on this, the last week of seasons are like a low point in terms of play. But also, and this is a weird one, I think that coming out right before a week where 2 cards come out means that there's 2 chances for that card to lose focus, for that card, for people to just get distracted and then never come back to it. And I think that's a weird thing that happens too. This isn't a fully formed thesis, but there is definitely some sort of weirdness that I'd like to investigate on a bunch of different levels with regards to how Marvel Snap's card acquisition and the way it does card acquisition impacts the metagame. I feel like Red Guardian could lose the point of power. I agree. I think Red Guardian is a little bit too good. I don't really know what else to say about that beyond the fact that it is a 3/5 effectively and also solves all these problems does make me feel like it could lose a point of power pretty reasonably. This would, of course, also boost my ego. My only cards that I've ever gotten to do a video on the main Marvel Snap channel for were High Evolutionary and Red Guardian. If both of them get nerfed, basically you can just pencil in my next card as something that's also going to get nerfed if I ever get to do another one of those. Obviously, that would suit my ego. My only ever preview cards are nerfable, busted ones. I think Red Guardian's a little too strong. I think that it is, yeah, reasonably you could say it's a point of power too strong. I think that if they took a point of power off Red Guardian, maybe made it do -1, maybe made it do 3/2, I would be playing it in all the same decks. I think, interestingly, the -1, when I think about those two possibilities in my head, the -1 feels way more palatable to me. Because there are so many ways of alleviating the minus already, so that, like, you know, Luke Cage, Shadow King type stuff, like, the minus isn't always gonna matter. But it being still a 3/3, I think that would be I think 3/3 -1 is a stronger card than 3/2 -2, and would be a lesser nerf. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, they could probably just do that. Tired of the Season Pass cards just being way better than any other cards, just for them to get nerfed after the season ends. Fuck Iron Patriot. I don't feel like dropping $10 on a card just to feel scummy. So, I'm not sure there's actually a pattern of this. Like, Anti-Venom, I think, is the biggest mistake they made balance-wise, in terms of a single card, probably the entire year. And they nerfed it. And Anti-Venom is still really good. Like, you're not getting robbed having had a nerfed Anti-Venom. It's still really strong. Surtur released strong and then got nerfed. And I'm not going to say he disappeared, but frankly, he went away a lot more than I would expect a 1-power nerf to do. I kind of wonder if they can't 3/5 him again. Like, maybe I'm way off base here, but it kind of seems like maybe they over-nerfed Surtur to me. I mean, I certainly don't see a lot of that guy running around right now. And Galacta, I think a lot of people said this about. I don't think she was either. I think you could argue she was the second strongest card of last month. She definitely wasn't the strongest. I know that. And she might not have been second either. And so I really don't think that this is a justified sentiment. Where, when you look at what they've actually done it to, it has been stuff that has been, like, objectively hugely problematic. And, you know, maybe Iron Patriot gets to that level, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it is. And I also think that one of the interesting things about these cards is, like, you didn't get robbed if you bought Anti-Venom, or Agent Venom. He's still doing exactly that thing, and he's still one of the best cards in the game. You can still build around him in ways that you can't build around any other card. And I kind of think that that's good. I kind of think that it's like, all right, they have gotten to a point where it's like, if they release something too strong and it gets nerfed after the season, they're going to make sure that it stays good. Surtur got nerfed in his season, for the record. Which, again, going back and looking, like, do you guys see a bunch of Surtur? Are we sure we can't 3/5 him again? I'm not. And so when you talk about this as like a thing that is like, you're tired of it happening, I think the only time it's happened was Agent Venom. That's it. And so I guess I don't really see the pattern here. Like, I'm not really like seeing the massive historical pattern of this happening. It seems like a thing that'll happen some of the time. But I think beyond that, I think they have a really tough job if you're willing to give them this. Not in terms of balancing things, but in terms of the specific timing that the economy forces on them. And what I mean by that is, like, if a card comes out and it's really strong and good, they can be like, okay, that's fine, as long as it doesn't stay really strong and good, right? So a card being really strong for like 2 to 4 weeks and then sort of falling into obscurity, we just talked about how that actually does happen a lot in this game. So if, let's say they're like, all right, we'll let it ride and we'll see if the metagame can develop around it, right? And then 2 weeks later, they're like, it didn't develop around it, now we have to nerf it. Guess what? It's not that card's season anymore. And I think they are almost sort of priced into putting themselves in awkward situations in that way. Because objectively, I can look at it and I can be like, you know what? I get it. It is actually worse if Anti-Venom is good for 8 weeks than it is if anti-venom is good for 4 weeks. And I can actually believe that there might be a world where that can just happen naturally. But the more you have a premium on, like, we want the metagame to constantly shift, the more you can't run the risk of being wrong about whether a card can naturally be beaten. For example, their Shadow King buff to try to deal with anti-venom when it was really good, or Agent Venom when it was really good. The more, like, you can't do that if you're going to put a premium on having the meta rotate. Because if it doesn't work, you're going to end up nerfing the card that is actually the problem. And that's sort of the awkward bit about the way they design, where it's like, I totally understand objectively that you are much more okay letting a card breathe when it's breathing for 3 weeks as opposed to 8 weeks. That makes perfect sense. But because people will get this perception of you if you wait too long to nerf a card, they will look at it like you are pump and dumping. I don't think they can afford to think like that anymore. What is going on, y'all? It is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see what takes we have next. Have a good one.